Welcome, everybody. We are excited to have you here today. My name is Joel Cornett, and I am a solutions consultant with Eagle Business Software. I started here in 2014, originally in the IT division when we used to have that, and now focus on the hardware aspects of EBMS, as well as managing our beta program, among many other things. Today is our security and advanced security webinar. So for the next couple of minutes, we're going to be going over the various aspects of securing your data, like why you would want to do that and how. We are going to have a live Q&A at the end, so please post your questions in the chat using the chat icon in your toolbar. The chat is private until the moderator posts the questions for public view. After the webinar, we'll send a follow-up email that will have a Q&A summary and a recording of the webinar for you to review with your team members or to share. If you experience any technical issues, we encourage you to disconnect and reconnect to the webinar. And if you're still having challenges, please let us know in the chat or call the support line and we would be happy to help you out. So let's get started. The first thing we want to look at today is why. Why do we need to set security? Why should we care about security? Well, there are a few reasons. The first, and likely the one people think of most, is to prevent people from accessing sensitive or private information. Your salespeople likely don't need to access employee payroll. Your technicians probably don't need to access vendors or purchasing. But that's not its only function. You can also use the security to block new users from inadvertently launching EBMS functions that may mess something up or change large amounts of data. You can use it to restrict access to utilities that only need to be run periodically, like month close, from users who don't need to perform that function. And lastly, you can use it to help with an audit trail, as it will stamp date, time, and username on transactions and documents. So now that we've talked about why, let's talk about how to do this. And we're going to look at 4 things today. The first is server security. Then we're going to look at EBMS UI security, then report security, and last, advanced UI security. So the first place I want to talk about security is your server itself. I know this is an EBMS webinar, but if you do all the EBMS stuff we're going to talk about, but don't secure your server itself, then your data is still not secure. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but we want to talk about just a couple of quick things. One, your EBMS data files should not be accessible via Windows File Share. In other words, if I'm on a workstation, I should not be able to access the actual tables via Windows File Share. Now, you do need the installer to be shared, but that can be shared without sharing the company data files. 2, users should not use the server as a workstation. This applies especially to non-administrator users, although we recommend that no user uses the server as a workstation. This opens up the ability for them to potentially access and modify the data files directly. I would strongly recommend that you have your IT audit the access to EBMS files and make adjustments as necessary, and we are more than happy to help you with that and work with your IT on that if needed. So once you have your server secured, we want to look at EBMS. For today's webinar, we're going to be using Firefly Transport Company as an example. Firefly Transport Company is a shipping and transport operation owned by Malcolm Reynolds. They are unique in that sometimes they will pay vendors for goods up front, transport the goods, and then collect payment from the customer upon delivery, with an upcharge, of course. And other times, they are paid by the customer to pick up and transport the goods. Their transport vehicle is owned by Malcolm Reynolds' other business, Serenity Valley Asset Management, and that vehicle is then leased to Firefly Transport Co. And I want you to keep this company in mind, as we're going to refer back to it as we go throughout the webinar. So the first thing in EBMS we want to look at is UI security. So let's start with usernames and passwords. This is the most basic level of security and the base thing that needs to be set for everything else we're going to talk about. Everyone who logs into EBMS should have their own username and password. There are some situations, like a point of sale system, where you may or should probably use a generic login. But for the most part, every user should have their own username and password. This is especially critical for the audit trail we talked about. If everyone is using the same username and password, then you have no way of knowing who made what transactions, who created or modified a document last, etc. Once you create the user, we need to set their permissions. On the name tab, there is a permission level there. This is the quote unquote master permission level. We'll get into the different permission levels in a minute, but what you set here will serve as the default permission level for everything else. And if something does not have a specific permission level specified, this is what it's going to use. Then we go over to the module tab of a user, and we can set the permissions at a very high level at the module level. We'll get into the more granular permissions in a bit, but this is kind of the first place you want to start. And the settings you set here apply anytime you need a username and password to access information, such as the EBMS ERP software, the My EBMS app for iOS, Android, and Windows, as well as webhooks and API. So what are the different permission levels and what do they do? First is administrator. Administrator users can access everything. They have full access to all data, functions, views, etc. And this user can also make changes to the security settings. So everything we are talking about today with EBMS will need to be done by an administrator. We do recommend that you only have 1 or 2 administrator users, so you don't have a lot of people making changes to users and security. We also would recommend that maybe you have an administrator user that only is used when you need to make these administrative changes. Maybe don't use an administrator in your day-to-day functions. The next level is manager. Users with manager security on something have full access to all that data, functions, views, etc. And it's very similar to administrator. However, they do not have access to change security. Next is advanced entry. This grants general read and write access to data, but blocks access to some settings, some manager tools, and advanced utilities. This is kind of what we recommend to be the default permission level for most workers who don't need manager permission unless you need to specifically lower them for something. Fourth is basic entry. This blocks access to profit data, settings, and many utilities in history. This is the level you might give to a generic point of sale user that you use at your sales counter or checkout line. Fifth is viewer. This blocks access to all data entry and grants read-only access to some data. And last is no access. This blocks the user from reading or writing data at all. So going back to Firefly Transport Co., Malcolm has a number of employees who each serve a critical role in the company. Kaylee is their mechanic. Her job is to keep the vehicle running. So she needs to be able to create, assign, and manage tasks and inventory. She also needs to be able to create purchase orders for parts that she needs. So she is a manager of inventory and tasks, but you'll see here that her permissions are not correct because she's listed as only having basic entry into expenses, and she should have advanced entry so she can create her purchase orders. So we'll need to fix that. Next is Jane. Jane is in charge of public relations and accounts receivable. Jane has advanced entry capability into sales and tasks. And lastly for today is Zoe. She is the general manager. She's Malcolm's right-hand person. So she's capable of doing everything he can in the business, and so her permission level is set to manager, so she can do everything but change security settings. And he has a number of other employees, contractors, etc., but for today's webinar, they aren't relevant. So I mentioned that we're going to need to fix Kaylee's permissions, so let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to hop over here to EBMS, and I am logged in as an administrator user. So we're going to go over here to File, and then down to User Management. And then we're going to come over here and we're going to pull up Kaylee's worker record or username here. And we're going to come over to Module, and we're going to take the expenses, and we are going to change this to advanced entry. And then we're going to verify tasks and inventory are both manager, and she should be basic entry to the rest. So that looks good. And we're going to go ahead and hit OK. to save those changes. So now that we've created a user account for every user and set their permissions for the modules, let's look at how we can make some adjustments to that, because there may be things that your advanced entry users shouldn't be able to see, like maybe you don't want your salespeople to see the cost of a product. So we're going to look at the field level UI security settings. This can be set on just about every menu item, button, box, field, tab in EBMS. Think of it as restricting access to that column, or restricting access to the button, or if you're looking at a table, like a list of vendors or things like that, you're restricting access to an entire column of data. To make these changes, again, you need to log in as an administrator, and then you simply right-click on the field you want to set the security for, and then you click on Set Security. And that's going to bring up this dialog box here. So here you can determine what exactly each security level can do. And there are 5 options here. There's full access, who can read, they can read and write to this field. You have read-only access, who can read and not make changes. No access means they cannot see it. If the item itself cannot be hidden, then the option will be grayed out, or the user will receive an error message when they try and view it. And 4th option is check parent. This is going to go up a level and see what permission is there and apply the same permission to this item. So in the screenshot, you can see that we are in the customer record as indicated by the AR cust in the beginning. And then we're also looking at the grace period field indicated by grace. So if this is set to check parent, then what the grace field is going to do is it's going to look at the AR cust record, the customer record itself, and see what permissions are being granted there, and then give the same permission to the grace field. And the last option you have here is evaluate expression. And we'll come back to this one, but this is where you would use advanced security. So we'll dig into that a little more at that point in time. So again, you can set this per field like you see here. You can set it per function, like you'll see here where we are doing it on the pay type buttons. Or you can set it per tab, like you see here where we're doing it on the terms tab of a record. So let's take a look at this in EBMS. Now, Jane works in accounts receivable. He's the one whose job it is to collect payments from customers, especially if they are trying to avoid paying. So he needs to be able to view invoices, contact information, etc. But Jane has a tendency to run his mouth a little bit. So Malcolm really doesn't need him, or anyone not involved in purchasing, from being able to see the cost. So first we're going to go into our product catalog, and we're going to pull up a product. And I'm going to use cows for now. So we open this up, and we're going to go over to the pricing tab. And then we're going to go to the cost field here, and we're going to right click and come down to set security. So I don't want to block Jane from seeing the inventory. So we're going to stay on this screen and we're looking at inventory cost. And we want to set this so that only certain people have permission. So Malcolm doesn't want anybody who's not a manager of inventory to be able to see cost. So we're going to make sure that only managers have full access. So we're going to change advanced entry here to no access, and basic entry is already set. Viewer, no access. Okay, all those look good. And just to make sure that manager is set properly, we're going to hit view parent, and we can see that manager has full access. So we're going to say OK and hit OK. So we've just set the security for the inventory item, but we also want to set it for the invoice itself, since that is actually where Jane will most often be making the changes. So we're going to open up invoices, and we're just going to open up any invoice. And we're going to scroll over here to the cost field. And we're going to come up, we are going to right click, come down to set security. And again, we're going to set this so that managers have the permission, and we'll verify the parent in a minute, but we're going to set advanced entry to be no access. and verify basic entry viewer no access, all have no access. Check the parent, manager has full access. All right. Looks like we are good to go. Permissions are set. So that's everything for UI security. Please remember to post your questions in the chat if you have questions about UI security, so we can answer them at the end. If you send them now, you don't have to worry about forgetting or remembering your questions at the end. So we're going to move on to report security. Now this is going to be a fairly short section, but the first thing to note about report security is that UI security settings do not apply to reports. So just because I blocked Jane from being able to see the cost in EBMS, if he's able to access a report that shows the cost, he could still see the cost by printing that report. So it is very important that you evaluate your report security as well. To check or set the security of a report, you're going to want to go to File, Reports, and then click on the report you want to make changes to, and click on Properties. Here you will see who can and cannot access the report. At the top of the window, you'll see where it says Report Path. There it has a 2-letter code, IN, AP, AR, GL, etc. This tells you what module the report belongs to. Note that sometimes you might have a report that belongs to one module in the folder of another. Like you might have an inventory report in your financials or in your sales folder. Or maybe you have a folder that doesn't belong to any module, like a mobile scanner folder for when you're using mobile scanner and want to be able to print things, or a month-end report folder, which has a variety of reports from multiple modules all around month close. Security for the report is set by the module the report belongs to. So if it says IN at the top, then you are setting permissions based on the user's inventory module permissions, even if that's in a sales folder or a folder not related to the module. And reports only have 2 security options. Can run the report, can access, cannot run the report, cannot access. You can move the various roles back and forth to give permission or deny permission. Again, you cannot block content on that report. So it is very important to think about who can run the report. So let's go back into EBMS and let's look at a report. So we're going to come over here to File and Reports, and we're going to look at the month-end report folder. So we've got accounts payable invoice aging. These are invoices that need to be paid to vendors after a certain date and have not been paid yet. So Malcolm doesn't want anybody other than administrators and managers to be able to run this report. So we're going to come in and we're going to see that this is already set that advanced entry and external access can access this report and can run it. So we're going to go ahead and just select and then say disallow and disallow. And now we have that administrators and managers can print this report and nobody else can. And we'll say OK. And then let's do the same thing with the accounts receivable aging. So again, we'll go into properties and we'll move the advanced entry over and the external access over and say OK. So that's really everything for report security. As I said, it is a simple section, but it is incredibly important because if you don't set it here, everything else we do with UI security can be bypassed with the right report. So if you have questions about report security, please post them in the chat so you don't forget. As we move on to the last thing we want to talk about today, and probably the most complicated thing, advanced UI security. Advanced security does require that you know a little bit about EBMS tables and fields and have the knowledge or ability to write database expressions. So with advanced security, it is UI based. Means it's basing it off of the username and password that you have set up for your users. And it can be used anywhere that standard UI security is used. The difference between advanced security and regular UI security is that regular security applies to the field across the board. So if I block the customer's phone number using regular security, then the customer's phone number field is blocked for every customer at that security level. Because again, I'm blocking the column or the field of the database. Advanced security sets permissions based on the content of a field. So it will say if the field contains a specific value, then users with this permission level can do this. Users with that permission level can do that. And you set it by using the evaluate expression option under the UI security. And then we're going to set a formula, and I'll show you a couple formulas in a little bit here. But since this is most commonly used with customers and vendors, we have provided a special field activated by a checkbox. The field is called secure, but you can see here where it says activate advanced security for this customer, and you would see the same similar thing for the vendor, activate advanced security for this vendor. When you turn this on, you can now use that secure field to set permissions based on this setting. So let's go back to EBMS and Firefly Transport Company. Kaylee needs to be able to do purchasing. So she needs access to the vendor list, their invoices. She needs to be able to create them, view them, know what's come in, etc. However, Malcolm does not want anybody other than managers to be able to see anything about Serenity Valley Asset Management, as he doesn't want them to know how much they pay to lease their vehicle. So logged in as an administrator, we're going to go over to vendors and pull up our vendor list. And we can see here that we have Serenity Valley Asset Management. So we're going to open it up. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the Advanced Security tab, and we're going to turn it on. Activate Advanced Security for this vendor. So now we want to block access to the entire vendor. There's a number of ways you can get there, but the easiest, since we're right here, is if you just right click on the vendor ID, go down to Set Security, and we're going to View Parent. And you can see here now that we are looking at the AP vendor record, the entire vendor record as a whole. So what we want to do is for advanced and basic entry, we want to block their access to any secured vendor. So we're going to take advanced entry. We're going to select this and say evaluate expression. Let me expand my window out here a little bit. And we'll set basic entry to be the same. So now we need to set our formula. So if you want to do the secure field, we want to set up our formula like this. We're going to say if, and note that there are two I's there, and that is intentional. That is the way this formula is written. Open parentheses. And then we want to use the field name, in this case is secure. So if secure equals .t dot, that's for true. So in other words, true meaning the box is checked. So if secure is on, and note that the dots in front of, and behind the T, if you wanted it to be false, you would have to do .f dot. And then we're going to put a comma in, and then we're going to put in two numbers to specify what permissions they are. So for this one, we're going to do the number 3 first, and then a comma, and then a 0, and then close the parentheses. So the first number is what happens when the expression is true. So if secure is true, number 1, the first set of numbers here is what we're doing. If that setting is false, in other words, if the box is unchecked, use the second number. And what these different numbers are is that 0 is full access, 1 would be read-only, and 3 is no access. So here we're saying that if secure is true, if that box is checked, then advanced entry users should have no access to this vendor. However, if the security is false, if that box is unchecked, then the 0 indicates that they have full access to that vendor. So then we're just going to go ahead and copy the whole expression here, and we're going to paste it into basic entry, and then we're going to check the other permissions as well. So viewers, let's go ahead and just say no access. They shouldn't be able to view vendors at all. Managers have full access. That looks good. So we're going to say OK. We're going to verify here that all the permissions are set to check parent. And we'll say OK. So we have just blocked the vendor access to this vendor if you're not a manager. So a couple of things to be aware of with these expressions. Your formula can use any field from the same table. But you cannot use an expression using fields from different tables. So for example, you cannot evaluate an expression on vendor permissions based on a field from the customer table. If you want to know what field or what table a field belongs to, you simply right-click on the field, hold down the Shift and Control key on the left side of your keyboard while selecting what's this. Then you're going to see that there is a file name and a field name. The file name is the table, and the field name is the field that you happen to click on. So in this case, we're looking at AR Cust, and we're looking at the Grace field. So for advanced security with expressions, the fields you use in that expression must come from the same table. So in this case, if you wanted to set an expression for the Grace field, it would need to contain fields from the AR Cust table. You couldn't do it from the AP vendor table. We do have more details on the different types of database expressions you can use in our documentation. I'm not going to get into all of them because there's a lot and they're very complex. But if you go to info.eaglebusinesssoftware.com, hover over knowledge base and click on documentation, and then click on the main documentation. If we hit the plus to expand out the technical, and then we can click on the database expressions to view more about those and see more information. So let's talk about some best practices with advanced security. First, advanced security is just that, advanced. It is something you should be using sparingly in your business. Ask yourself the question, why do I need to set this before you do? I would estimate that probably 90% of the time, you likely either need to change a user's permission level, change the permissions via standard UI security, or check, maybe your business practices or your business process and make sure that you have the right people in the right place. The more you use advanced security, the more complicated things can become. And then if something is not working right, it becomes harder to troubleshoot and figure out where the issue is. Also, do not assume that whatever you're going to do is going to work. Test it. You can do this two different ways. You can either create a test dummy user, and then you set those permissions and set the permissions at the user level and log in with that user and verify, or log in as a user that you know should be affected by the changes you have made. So that's the example we're going to use today as we check this out. So if we go back into EBMS, we've made a couple of changes today. So we want to make sure that these changes are correct. So we're actually going to first close EBMS here. And we want to log in as Kaylee. We're going to start with the more complicated one with the advanced security. So we're going to log in here as Kaylee. So we denied her permission to view the Serenity Valley Asset Management vendor. So if we open up vendors, we can see that where Serenity Valley Asset Management should be, because we cannot hide it because we're loading a list, it has been grayed out. That is fantastic. That is exactly what we want to see. So let's go ahead and sign out and sign back in as Zoe, because Zoe is a manager and we want to make sure that she can see that still. So we're going to go ahead and change the login name to Zoe. And then we're going to open up our vendors again. Great. She can see the Serenity Valley Asset Management vendor. So she can see what she needs to. And then earlier, we also blocked Jane from being able to see costs in EBMS, specifically in the inventory records as well as on invoices. So we should verify that he does not have permission to see those things. So we're going to open up EBMS again, and we're going to go ahead and log in as Jane. So great, he can't see the vendor either. But we're going to go ahead and come over here to product catalog, and let's go ahead and open up cattle. If we come over here to the pricing tab, we can see that cost, among several other things, because he is only basic entry into EBMS, is all hidden from him. That's great. So let's go ahead and close that, and we will close inventory. And then let's go over to that invoice that we were looking at earlier. And if we scroll over here, we can see that the cost column is grayed out for Jane. Perfect. This is exactly what we wanted. So now when Jane is pulling up invoices to go after the people who are not paying their bills, he's not seeing the cost, he's just seeing their totals and how much they need to be paying. So then lastly, we're going to just check the reports. Because Jane is not a manager in anything, he should not be able to see either of the reports that we restricted earlier. So if we come in here, and again, because we can't hide it, and in this case, we can't gray it out nicely, if we go ahead and try and run the report, we get an error message. You do not have sufficient permissions to perform this operation. So he's been blocked from both the accounts payable and the accounts receivable. Good. So let's look at a few other examples of advanced security. The first one is to hide all processed sales orders. This might be a good one to use for someone like Jane, who really only needs to be dealing with unprocessed sales orders or unpaid sales orders, things like that. So the expression we would use for that is if the status is anything other, is only unprocessed, anything else that gets excluded, and the invoice is not blank, so it has a value in the invoice number, then we're going to deny permission. If both of those are, if one of those is false, then we're going to go ahead and grant permission. We can also just block invoices. Maybe you want your salespeople to maybe, or your vendors or purchasing to be able to see the vendors, but you don't want them to see the invoices. So again, we could set expressions to do if the secure is true and the invoice has a value, grant or deny permissions based off of that. A couple other examples that I know we've used in the past. Allow viewing of invoices where the user is the salesperson. So if the user is the salesperson, and that is blank, which means it's going to use your current user, then grant permission. If the user is not the salesperson, then we're going to deny permission to that invoice. And last example we have for today is to allow the viewing of invoices where the user is either the salesperson or Bob. Maybe Bob is a sales manager, but you don't necessarily want to give him full manager permissions. So we can say, hey, if the user is the salesman or the user is Bob, then grant permission. If the user is anybody other than the salesperson or Bob, deny permission. As you can see, advanced security is very complicated, but also incredibly powerful and flexible. So we recommend that this is an advanced feature. It is something that you use sparingly. I would almost say as a last resort. If there's any other way you can work around it, using regular security, changing user permission levels, or changing your business process, I would recommend using those first. Only if you really absolutely need to, should you get into advanced security. So to quickly recap, we talked about the importance of securing your server itself, because if you make all these other changes, but people have direct access to the tables, they can still find or change any information they would like. We looked at EBMS basic security, usernames and passwords for every user, audit trails, easier to grant permissions, make changes, etc. We looked at report security and how it differs from UI security in that you can only grant permission to run or not run, and it is based on the module the report belongs to, not the folder. And then we looked at advanced security and how powerful and flexible that is while also being incredibly complex. So please post your questions in the chat if you've not done so, as I'm now going to turn it over to Dorothy for our Q&A session. Dorothy?
Thank you, Joel. As we saw today, the security feature is a very important tool to use within EBMS. Let's go ahead and move into our question and answer session. If you've not answered or entered a question yet, please enter it into the chat box where we can publish that and have your questions answered. For our first question, let's go ahead and here's one, Joel. Can I set security settings to have my salesman not be able to delete a sales order?
Not specifically to delete, to my knowledge. I will say I am not an expert on all of the possible database expressions that are available, but to my knowledge, you can't set permission to not delete but still make changes. You could set it to read only, where they can't make changes to that field or to that invoice, but your options are basically full access, read only access, or no access.
Okay. All right, thank you. Another one here. Can admin and manager users be able to change security, or is it only administrator?
Only administrator users. That's the key difference between the two security levels. Managers cannot set permissions and security things. Administrators can.
Okay, thank you. All right, another one here. Are there any logs that I can see what fields users are accessing that the admin may not realize?
I am not sure. I know that we do have a lot of various logs in EBMS. I do not know if there's one that would specifically tell you what fields are being accessed by the user or being changed by a user. That's something we'll have to look into and get back to you on.
Sure, and we can publish that in our Q&A with the webinar as well.
Yep.
All right. We have one of our users using the server as her main computer for EBMS. Can you list some of the risks we face because of this?
Yep. So even though you may set her permissions in EBMS where she can't change things through EBMS itself, because she is using the server as her workstation, she likely has the ability, I don't know if she has the knowledge, but she would have the capability to get into the actual tables where all of this data is stored. So she could actually go in there and make changes to the data or view the data, even things you may have blocked from her. If she knows what table to look in, she could open it up and find the information that she wanted to see or make changes to that information.
All right, very well. All right, for our last, let me just see, for our last question, or I do have another one here. Does the EBMS security settings not apply to server access?
If you're talking about server access directly, like to the tables and fields themselves, the files, no. EBMS. That's why we call it EBMS UI security. It only applies to the things that you are doing through EBMS, the main EBMS application, or through like the My EBMS app or the webhooks and API. It does not make any changes in terms of users who may try and access it via the actual files on the server.
Correct.
And that's why locking that information down is so important on the server itself.
That would be a separate Windows securities, right?
Yep. And that's something your IT would need to look at. We're more than happy to work with your IT and help with them with that. But that would be an IT kind of thing.
Right. All right, for our last one here, I have one more. How do I remove a user or temporarily disable them?
Sure. So let me just hop back into EBMS here. And we're going to go ahead and log in as administrator again. So if we come up here and we go to File, User Management, there are a couple ways you can do it. One is, let's take someone here, River. So River has no access. You could also just set her to inactive. Both of those would allow you to basically deny their permission to everything. Inactive won't even let them log in. No access means that once they're in, they can't see anything. That's going to be their default permission level.
You cannot delete with if they have history of transactions, correct?
I believe you can. I'd have to double check that, but I believe you could delete the user. Yeah, I'd have to double check that.
Okay, sure. All right, thank you all for your questions and participation. We will go ahead and turn this back over to Joel and let him close our webinar.
All right. Thank you very much, Dorothy. There is a lot more that we could cover that we didn't have a chance to, especially with advanced security and how complex and powerful that is. Part of your EBMS subscription does include a 90-minute consultation that is available to you. And so if you're more interested in this and would like a little more one-on-one time to look at your specific use case or scenario, this might be a great thing to use that 90-minute consultation on. Reach out to your account manager, let them know you'd like to use it, and we'll get that scheduled. A couple upcoming webinars. On October 13th, we have our Advanced Queries webinar at 11:30 a.m. We're going to cover exactly how to find what data you need using queries. Check out our website, our events page at www.eaglebusinesssoftware.com/events for details on this webinar, to reserve a spot for it, as well as other upcoming webinars and events. We will have the video available and the Q&A summary coming out to you shortly that you can take back to share with your staff. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to our support team or your account manager directly, and we would be happy to help. So that concludes our time together today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are excited that we can continue to do this with you. Be kind, be well, and stay safe. Thank you.